I'm Moises Naim, and I'm welcoming you to the book club conversation about Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe by Niall Ferguson, who is here with us, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, Neil. I work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm a member of the editorial board of Persuasion, and I thank you very much for joining us. I will start with a few questions and then open it up to your comments, reactions, questions, and conversation. And I hope we can have it as dynamic as possible. So, Neil, the politics of catastrophe, doom. One would expect that with all our knowledge, all the technology, all the new science, all the disruptive technologies, and all that we hear about innovation and progress, we would be better prepared to deal with catastrophes. And you question that. You say that despite all of the progress, the aspects of the human experience, anticipating catastrophes is not a place where one can rejoice about progress. Tell us about that.
Thanks, Moises, and thank you so much for doing this. I know you're standing in for Yasha, but I very much appreciate the chance to talk to you about this subject. Yes, Doom is an attempt to write a general history of disasters of all kinds. It was actually something I was thinking about before COVID-19 struck, but when the pandemic began, I suddenly realized that I had an urgent and pressing need to write this book. And I think the answer to your question is, I think, threefold. First of all, as we have progressed with scientific knowledge, which of course we have also made ourselves more vulnerable as a species. And that is because we've built the ultimate contagion transmission mechanism, not only in terms of our global travel habit, but we also are pretty good at transmitting digital contagion too through the internet. So I think one lesson of this book is that we take 2 steps forward with scientific knowledge and maybe 1 step back by making ourselves more vulnerable than we were before. The second part of the answer is that I think in the relatively recent past, we've developed a way of thinking about risk and potential disaster, which is superficially rational, but in reality deeply irrational. And this is illustrated by the phenomenon of the pandemic preparedness plan. On paper, the United States and the United Kingdom were very well prepared for a pandemic, and they were rated as such by international agencies. But the key words in my sentence are on paper, because if you measured preparedness by the number of pages that public health bureaucrats generated of preparedness, then they were very prepared. But when there actually was a pandemic, all of these preparations turned out to be quite illusory. And our response was sluggish, where it should have been swift and often misguided. So I think that's the second part of the answer. But I think there's a sort of third piece to it, which is that we probably are less good at thinking about disaster because of our relatively recent tendency to politicize everything. And this is a very American problem that's not so pronounced elsewhere, though it does exist elsewhere. Everything is a partisan issue. Things that in the 1950s were not regarded as political, like vaccines, have become political partisan issues. And that makes it very hard to have a rational conversation about public health. But I don't think this is peculiar to public health. I think whatever the disaster, the responses would very quickly become a partisan issue. And that's really an inhibition to rational response to disaster.
Do you think that's a global trend, or do you think this is more common in the United States, or countries do a better job and to isolate the politics from away from the response? What's your intuition about that?
It's clearly not entirely global. None of what I've said is entirely global in the sense that we can find countries that cope very well with this disaster. Taiwan is a good illustration. South Korea did pretty well. And it seems as if it might be more true to say that the problems I'm discussing are Western, because it seems to me that the further west you go from Asia, the more you encounter first this problem of bureaucratization and pseudo-preparedness, and then this problem of excessive politicization. The United States, I think, has taken partisanship to an exceptional level, but it's there in Brazil and in many other American countries to some extent. It's just that I can't think of anywhere else where every issue, from masks to potential therapies, to, of course, vaccines, became partisan. And I looked in vain for polling data to show quite the perfect partisan division that seems to have developed in the United States.
Another message or takeaway in the book is your skepticism about using history to anticipate events. You are very, very doubtful that history is very useful in terms of helping understand what's coming. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, history is extremely useful for helping us to think about this problem. But if you study it rigorously, you realize that what it can't do is help us predict disaster. And it's an illusion, I think, to try to find any basis for predicting disasters, because disasters just are inherently in the realm of uncertainty, not calculable risk. In other words, you can't easily attach ex ante a probability to an earthquake in California. I'm hoping it's not going to happen now because it would really disrupt this conversation. But we know a big earthquake will happen at some point. We just have no way of knowing when or how big. And the same is true in a lot of different domains of disaster. Broadly speaking, to kind of talk in slightly wonkish speak, the disasters that really concern us as a species, the things that historians like to write about, are not normally distributed. So they're not like automobile accidents or human heights. They're either randomly distributed, which is true of wars, or they're kind of power law distributed, which is true of earthquakes and wildfires and indeed pandemics. So you get these, a few very, very big ones and lots of little ones, and just no way of knowing ex ante what the probabilities are. And so when you try to sort of torture history into a cyclical pattern, which has been a kind of objective of scholars for centuries, you're doing it partly because you kind of want history to be more regular, and in the hope that you'll get some predictability, but you're going to fail, because no matter how good you are at it, and some people are certainly very good at it, the truth is that there are too many random things and too many entirely kind of exogenous shocks hitting humanity for history to be cyclical in any meaningful way.
That's very interesting. You also show some optimism in the same way that you're very skeptic about uses of history. You're very optimistic about clio dynamics as a potential new tool, or new way of thinking or acting in terms of managing and thinking about these issues. What is how do you phrase it, clio dynamics?
This is an attempt by scholars, I think led by Peter Turchin, who didn't start life as a historian, to import into history some of the techniques that are familiar to people in STEM fields. And so it's quite data driven. There's some amazing work being done by Turchin and his collaborators to build enormous databases of civilizational development over very long timescales. And I'm a big fan of what they're trying to do, because I think it's tremendously illuminating. I don't think ultimately it will produce the key to all histories, as it were. I don't think they'll arrive at the grand explanatory framework and the historical cycles that Turchin himself has written about, because it seems inherently implausible to me that you could do that, given this pattern that I described of random shocks that keep getting administered to us as a species. But I think that the goal of cliodynamics, to think in a more rigorous way about historical change, and particularly about the ways that civilizations form and the cycles that they might possibly go through. This is a worthy endeavor. But remember, there are lots of other, perhaps less scholarly efforts to come up with cyclical theories. I mean, some people call me up and email me about the fourth turning, an idea that was popularized not so long ago and had a brief moment in the limelight when Steve Bannon said that he was inspired by it. If you even remember who Steve Bannon was, I think there's a lot of pseudo history out there that tries to kind of wrangle history into a cyclical pattern. Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, is doing it too. He has a kind of great super debt cycle theory, and I'm just deeply skeptical that all of this can really work without crimes against data, which I think get committed in all kinds of different ways by the people trying to construct cyclical theories of history. I'm sure left to our own devices as a species, we might well arrive at cycles of history, but there are just too many of these shocks that we call disasters to make that very likely.
Early in the book, you talk about, quote, the statistics of calamity, quote, which is the very famous phrase by Stalin, when it's based on that, in the aphorism that says that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. How do you connect the calamity, the statistics of calamity, to what's going on now?
Well, I wanted to try to first find out who said that first, because it's such a famous phrase and it usually gets attributed to Stalin. And it was rather nice to discover that was probably apocryphal and attributed to him first by a Washington Post columnist, Leonard Lyons, but then it turned out that Lyons had actually got it from Kurt Tucholsky. And he got it from a French diplomat. So I like trying to track down the origins of famous sayings, because it's a form of quote archaeology. The idea that you can't quite comprehend a million deaths, whereas one death, especially if it's of somebody close to you, looms very, very large, actually goes even further back. Adam Smith writes about this in the theory of moral sentiments, when he observes that if there's a huge earthquake in China and kills an enormous number of people, the sort of educated man might think about it and reflect sadly on it for a couple of minutes, but ultimately will be more concerned by an injury to his finger. And this is a central problem of the human predicament, that we struggle cognitively to understand and to empathize with mass death at a distance. I think you have to use statistics to get orders of magnitude, because there is a tendency, and we've noticed it in the past year, to categorize everything as the end of the world or something close to it at one extreme, because that's how some people react to disaster. And at the other extreme, there's a tendency to downplay disaster. And we had a lot of that in early 2020, because people on both the left and the right were very tempted to say, oh, it's just the seasonal flu, completely underestimating the likely scale of the pandemic. So part of what I do in the book is say, well, you know, what do we really call a big disaster? Well, a big disaster, a really big one, is the Black Death, where you're looking at maybe a third of the human race wiped out in an absolutely horrific and protracted pandemic that swept the entire Eurasian landmass. At the moment, the death toll from COVID is about 0.04%, which is about the same proportion of the world population that died in the 1957-58 Asian influenza. So clearly, a lot of the kind of commentary initially on this crisis was either downplaying it or exaggerating it. And the difficulty is actually to get the order of magnitude about right, because until you do that, you're not quite sure how to respond to a disaster.
You're one of the world's most famed, respected historians. You're also a TV personality, a thought leader, and you're also an advisor to company. You have a company that provides advice to other corporations. And you have claimed in the book, you mentioned that human societies and human history may be best described as adaptive complex systems. Is that what you use to frame the information and analysis that you provide to your clients?
Yeah, 10 years ago, I realized that I could do a bit more with history than simply teach undergraduates and graduates, and that actually there was a great appetite, particularly in the financial world, for better ways of thinking about not only financial markets, but politics, and that reliance on models, which of course is what economists like to use and political scientists too, was not delivering terrifically good results. One obvious consequence of the financial crisis was a frantic scramble to read up on the Great Depression, which most people sort of had heard of but knew nothing about, because most people in financial markets use the history of their own careers. That's the history they know. And when something happens that's sort of out of that sample, they're in trouble. So from around 2011, I started applying history in a more systematic way, talking to asset managers and banks to try to show that history offers a different way of dealing with risk management and not only political, but economic and financial risk. We're not peddling a model that sort of spits out a predictive set of statements, but rather using historical analogies to think about contemporary problems. This might seem like a fuzzier method, but it can actually be quite rigorous. So back in January of 2020, looking at what we knew so far about this strange new virus in Wuhan, I and my team hazarded a guess that this was going to be a very big pandemic. We didn't know how big, but it potentially could have been as bad as 1918-19. And it was certainly not going to be as trivial as swine flu in 2009. So the way that I work, and it's been what I've done most of my career, is essentially to start with analogies and ask, well, what is this like? It's not exactly like anything, but it's going to be more like one thing than the others. And once you've got that resemblance, you can start working out and thinking, well, if it's not as bad as 1918-19, but as bad as 1957-58, well, what does that mean in terms of mortality, and what does it mean in terms of the economic and likely political consequences? So having done this for 10 years, I think it's proved a fruitful method, and it certainly has made me more rigorous in my thinking about present and future trends, because part of what you realize is that it's impossible to predict the future, and people who claim with great confidence that they can are selling snake oil, but you can start attaching probabilities to at least some scenarios. But you just keep having to remind everybody that history broadly and large countries generally are complex systems, and they have the attributes of complexity in its strict sense. That is to say, you can't really model what they're like other than with unimaginably difficult math. And a complex system is something that sort of looks like it's in equilibrium a lot of the time, but can be tipped over into chaos by quite a modest sized perturbation. And that's the stuff to which it's really hard to attach probabilities, because those perturbations are not something that you probably see coming. It's knowing, I think, as R.G. Collingwood, the great Oxford philosopher of history, said, it's like looking for the tigers in the grass. If you spent enough time wandering through the woods, you've got an eye for the tiger in the grass. And that's really what historians, I think, have to offer to anybody who's making decisions in real time, whether it's financial or political.
I found the book is fascinating, and you provide very surprising examples. You also write, you have some very disturbing, to me at least, very disturbing phrases. One, perhaps one of the most disturbing is this: rumors of American doom are once again exaggerated. Perhaps because of this exaggeration, the risk of not just cold, but hot war is rising. Explain that.
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have confronted for some years now is that the US-China relationship has been moving into Cold War mode. And I think I argued this before the pandemic, that we're in Cold War II already. And the reason I think that is that if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is one. I mean, we've got an ideological rivalry, we've got a technological competition, there's a classic geopolitical dimension to this, with certain territories being contested, whether it's the South China Sea or Taiwan. And it's very clear, at least to me, that this Cold War has the potential to escalate, just as the original Cold War did, into hot war. Let's not forget that it was in 1950 that the Korean War broke out. And at that point, people were still arguing about whether there was a Cold War at all. I mean, not everybody had immediately been persuaded by the people who initially said there was a Cold War, Orwell, Churchill, and later Kennan. So when I look at the disasters that we confront in the near term, I think one obvious scenario is that the US-China relationship actually spills over from Cold War to hot war. And thinking about that is one of the things that I do towards the end of the book. The pandemic's made that relationship quite a bit worse than it already was. And it's also, I think, changed views in other countries with respect to the Chinese government. And you probably saw those surveys back in October, Moises, by Pew that showed a huge shift in sentiment towards China and specifically Xi Jinping in most developed countries. So I think we're more in Cold War than many of us want to accept. And that, again, by analogy, is a bit like the situation in the US in the 1940s, when many people still felt that the wartime relationship with the Soviet Union could continue. And it actually took a hot war to change many minds. I think when we're talking about this problem, we have to tread warily, because I think when Western intellectuals are confronted with the analogy, their sort of default reaction is to say, no, it can't be the Cold War, it must be something else. And I found a lot of pushback when I started saying, this is Cold War II, just the same way that World War II was a Second World War I. I mean, this is a second Cold War, and it has enough in common with the first Cold War for that analogy to work. And if it will be a success if we keep it cold. After all, in Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, the Cold War is one of the minority of cases when the rising power and the incumbent power didn't end up in a hot war. So, my view is if we can keep this cold, that will be a historical success.
Let's hope it's possible. Let me open it up. I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So let me invite people in the audience to just raise your hands, and you know how it is done. And we will recognize you and invite you for your question or comments. I
see Jerome Levkov has already posted a question on the chat bar, which is an option for us. Jerome, do you want to go ahead and pose that orally?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So you mentioned that you're advising companies, your company is advising businesses how to think about their businesses in terms of your historical analysis. And so I'm wondering, using analysis of history, have you thought about the probabilities, that are listed in the chat, the United States engaging in a civil war, in lapsing into a dictatorship, in returning to a normal two-party democracy? I guess that's enough.
Great question. Well, I've thought and written quite a bit about that. When Trump's candidacy first began to look plausible in 2015, quite a number of writers, including good friends of mine like Tim Snyder and Andrew Sullivan, began to say the end of the Republic is nigh, and we're headed for Weimar. The Constitution won't be able to cope if this man becomes president. And my view, which I put into columns and a book, The Square and the Tower, as well as in the things I said to people I advised, was that this was a little bit overdone, and that firstly, the founders had designed the Constitution with a character like Trump in mind. It's quite interesting how Alexander Hamilton explicitly says that there'll be some demagogue who loves to pander to the worst instincts of the people who will someday be president. And I think they built the Constitution with a bunch of pretty effective safeguards in place to make sure that such a figure would not be able to trash the system. And I think although there was still a very big media appetite for its Weimar America all the way down until January the 6th, in truth, the system has withstood the stress a lot better than Tim Snyder with his visions of totalitarian America, or Andrew Sullivan with his visions of Weimar America thought. And I'd say that, in an attempt to be dispassionate, that the courts consistently thwarted Trump. The Republicans lost the midterms, which again is the way the system's kind of designed to work, and Trump lost the election, having bungled the pandemic. It's also interesting, isn't it, that something that's not in the Constitution, namely the bureaucracy, didn't exactly keel over in support of him, and nor did critical parts of the Republican Party, which is something that people forget when they look back on the election. If there had been a unanimous effort by Republicans to undermine the election, it might have got further than it did. But in fact, quite a lot of Republicans at the state level knew that it was a lost election and acted accordingly. So I said to people who asked my opinion on this that the system would prove resilient, and I also think that Trump will fade faster from the scene than people currently think. There's no real substitute in place yet, and a lot of the impulses that got Trump elected are still out there. But I think he himself will not really be a relevant figure by the time we get to 2024, because someone else will have come along to offer the same policies with perhaps a higher level of competence. I think Greenmantle, which is the name of my business, did well in the election because we didn't believe the polls and we never thought there was going to be a blue wave. But we also thought that Trump would lose. And we thought he'd lose because he'd lost critical votes amongst, for example, elderly voters in the key states that had been crucial to him in 2016. So I give very high marks to my US team who called that right, kept their heads at a time when there was a lot of kind of rather vehement debate in the media between the blue wavers and the people who thought Trump would somehow magically win. It was a close result. If one looks at how the Republicans did down ballot, it was anything but a blue wave. And I may say that in answer to your question more broadly, the bad use of history, the use of really dodgy historical analogies is something that I see far too much of. It's kind of always the 1930s, isn't it? Whatever the situation. I have a friend whose father used to say, "Oh no, it's the 1930s all over again, all over again." And I sometimes feel that listening to a lot of media commentary. It's like journalists only seem to know the history of the 1930s, but I don't think our time is like the 1930s. I don't think it's remotely like it. If you had a time machine and you went back to the 1930s, you would just be stunned by how different the world was then. And that's why I never bought the Trump is Hitler, Trump is Mussolini story. I mean, I've studied that period. This is really, really different. And thinking that Trump was a fascist and his supporters were fascists was a massive category error based on a misunderstanding of the history of American populism. So long answer, but a great question.
And I see that Will O'Hare has a question. Will, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you addressed part of my question that I was going to say there. So I'm going to reframe this a little bit because I totally agree with you about we're not in a Weimar kind of situation, and the comparison is usually overwrought to the 1930s. I also just want to thank you for your time today and for this book, which I find really fascinating. I'm not all the way through it, and like in your conversation with Jonah Goldberg, I'm one of the vultures kind of pecking away at it. But for something, to be steeped in catastrophe it's really fascinating and entertaining. But one of the things that you really captured that I find fascinating is the idea of the allure of doom. And of course, that's filled our kind of popular imagination and culture, from books and novels. We're talking about people sitting down Contagion to Station 11 to Margaret Atwood and those kinds of things in this past year. And I think many of us have during the pandemic. And I've just been fascinated how that does cross into our politics. I mean, I don't make the comparison to the Weimar Republic and the threat of Trump as the same as Hitler, and yet the rise of something like QAnon and seeing folks adorned in QAnon kind of symbology, storming into the Capitol, I feel like, would that have happened if we weren't in a pandemic here? In the same token, you could argue on the other side, in the rise of the social justice movement, the language is the language of doom. There is this language of catastrophizing, everything from abolishing and dismantling, deconstructing, decolonizing. It's all about tearing down without seeming to offer much about what's going to replace it. And there's something that struck me in the way that you tied together that out of World War I was not only did we have the Spanish flu, but then Bolshevism is this kind of political catastrophe that was coming out of that. And so I guess my question to you is, do you see that ringing true with, let's say, what I was kind of categorizing as the social justice side, kind of using the language of catastrophe? And do you feel like that is also connected to the rise of that? If so, is connected to the pandemic as well?
Thanks, Will. It's a great question. We are, as a species, fascinated by doom, by the end of the world, by the great apocalyptic denouement, and all the major religions have some of that in there. I mean, especially Christianity and Islam. It's not quite so much a part of Judaism. But even some of the less well-known religions have some version of the apocalypse. And I think this is something that we're fascinated by and continue to be fascinated by, hence our love of science fiction, apocalyptic scenarios and dystopias. Actually, this book originated in a project to write a history of the future, looking at all the different ways in which we've imagined the end of the world and trying to make some sense of it. And it kind of grew from there once the pandemic struck. I think when you look at the way in 2020, the extremes of both left and right took even further steps across or along the spectrum, whether it's QAnon or the more radical Black Lives Matter or the anarcho-syndicalist types in Portland. I don't think it would have happened quite that way but for the pandemic. I don't think one can explain the mass protests of the summer without the lockdowns, because the sheer scale of those protests was really extraordinary. And in the book, I suggest that this had a kind of quasi-religious character to it, though I'm sure some people will take issue with that. In fact, if you look at some of the things that happened during those protests, it was almost medieval. This was a mass movement of expiation. The protesters, mostly white, in some places washing the feet of Black pastors, in other places offering up prayers of apology for past and present racism. So I think this looked like a political movement that was outwardly about the question of police violence, but in reality, to the historian's eye, it had a quasi-religious quality. And I couldn't help thinking of the flagellant orders of the 1340s who wandered around from town to town in Europe, whipping themselves to ward off further divine wrath. I think there's a lot of buried religion in our societies. That's an argument Tom Holland recently made in his book Dominion, and it exists also on the right, where you get a kind of mode of thinking which has a religious quality to it. It's certainly magical. I mean, when you've got a QAnon shaman as the key figure, or at least the most photogenic figure in the January the 6th protests, you realize that you've left the terrain of politics behind. And I think that's why I dislike that 1930s analogy so much because it's much, much more 16th and 17th century, this world we've entered. And the internet has had, and this was the argument of my last book, The Square and the Tower, the same impact on the public sphere as the printing press had. And at first, it seemed to people that it was rather useful to have the printing press. You could generate more and more copies of the Bible in the vernacular, and that had to be good. But you also were able to print books about witchcraft, which got a lot of people killed. And I think in the same way, we at first thought the internet was awesome. And now we realize that it's actually a machine for generating fake news and extreme views and propagating, disseminating those. So in my mind's eye, we're actually in a much more early modern time than we realize. Whereas the 1930s was a time when communications were highly centralized and you could get a totalitarian regime up and running because there really weren't that many ways to dissent once you had control of the radio and the newspapers. Today, we're in a very, very different world where the communications seem to me to be a lot like the aftermath of the printing press's spread, where anything goes and crazy stuff can go viral just as readily as sane stuff. So yeah, I think there's a lot of political religion out there. The United States has something of a history of great awakenings, and Matty Iglesias nailed it with the Great Awakening. I mean, Andrew Sullivan was another person who wrote really well on this, saw the way that the campus left was kind of religious in its tendencies, particularly in its desire for heretics to be at least cancelled, if not burned. So I'm not the first person to make this observation, but I think it makes a lot more sense when you're looking for analogies to see these as religious mindsets rather than political ones.
Thank you, Neil. Andrew, you have a question. Andrew Gagne?
Yes, thank you, Neil, for joining us this evening. My question is related to networks and Doom, which you've now written a book on each. And you sort of beat me to the punch, but I actually want to go back to chapter 4 when you do cite Adam Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Again, you explained it fairly well, but he essentially posits a situation where all of China is swallowed by an earthquake. We typically reflect on it with sadness, but then we very quickly go about our life. And I suppose this is sticking with me because, as much as I hate to admit it, this is sort of the same track I take when I see what's going on in India today. And I dare say I'm not alone when it comes to disasters elsewhere in the world. And yet, at the same time, unlike in the 1800s when Smith was writing, I almost feel with the size and scope of today's global network and our ability to receive and react to news, nearly instantaneously, there's less of an excuse to do little or face of doom when it strikes what effectively is our collective network. So I guess my question to you is, as we become more interconnected, does the massive size of our global network and the benefits it brings in 2021, should that also come or bring with it a level of responsibility, either on individuals, societies, or states to, do more, as it were, or to assist other nations or network nodes that are faced with disaster elsewhere? Or is this simply, too large of a political and moral undertaking that would potentially lead to, government overreach at an international level? I know you're personally not a fan of the term liberal international order, so I'm curious to get your take on this.
Well, yes, it's a great question. Adam Smith, as a kind of key figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, tended to push the notion that enlightened self-interest was the thing to bank on, and he tries to kind of arrive at that solution to the problem of our seeming indifference to the sufferings of people in faraway countries. Clearly, we live in a very different world from Smith, but it's striking how well his ideas continue to resonate. And I think that you're dead right to ask the question the way you did. From the vantage point of enlightened self-interest, it is not at all wise for us to solve the problem of COVID in the developed world and leave it unsolved in in less developed countries, because obviously as the disease is given more time to spread and more people to infect, its probability of mutating rises. And we are all on tenterhooks, really, to see if a mutation is going to arise that can evade or at least diminish the efficacy of the vaccines that we've all been frantically getting ourselves. So I think there's actually a much more plausible argument than in Smith's time to care about disasters in distant countries. And in particular, when it relates to infectious disease, we'll look back, if we haven't already begun doing so, and say the vaccines were a tremendous success in terms of their efficacy, but the way that we set about distributing them was suboptimal. The same issue arises, of course, with climate change. It's very clear, and this is one of the themes of the book, that the disastrous consequences of climate change will not be felt nearly so much in North America as they will be felt in Asia. Asia just has more and bigger disasters. It doesn't really matter what kind of disaster you're talking about. And I think that we will not be as ill affected. I mean, Africa too will almost certainly be more affected by climate change than North America. But that doesn't kind of let us off the hook, because if there is really large scale disastrous climate change in those very populous parts of the world, then we should not expect people just to sit there and starve. I mean, they will come, and they will come to Europe first. But ultimately, I think it's clear that a completely negligent attitude towards the rest of the world will mean mass migration to North America too, and not just from Central America. So I think that's the way I think about this. I think we have a major challenge in terms of governance, and I'm sure Moises would agree. And every time we have a conversation about climate change, I'm struck by how inconsequential it is, because almost nobody is prepared to say, though I keep saying it, that half of all the increase in CO2 emissions since the Paris Accord is accounted for by China. And nobody has a plan for constraining China. And the Chinese are perfectly capable of talking the talk without walking the walk when it comes to the way they generate power. And if they all buy Teslas, but charge them from electricity generated by burning coal, we are definitely not going to avoid the worst case scenario of the IPCC. So yeah, there are clearly global challenges that require global solutions, and our institutions, the liberal international order that you referred to, don't seem capable of delivering. And that's not an argument for scrapping them. That's an argument for thinking about how to give them real teeth. I think Paris without teeth is worthless. Ultimately, there have to be ways of constraining China, and it must be said, India. And I think that's why Cold War II becomes a climate issue, because ultimately, we're going to have to recognize that reducing emissions in the West will achieve nothing if emissions continue to rise in the East. And there's no point having endless talking matches at international conferences if that is going to be the pattern. So I think we can do, if we do better on vaccines, then we might be able to achieve something more on climate, almost on a tit for tat basis. But yeah, there's a long way to go on both those issues. That's clear.
Thank you. Mike Thalhurst, please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question about how we should think about the role of experts and decision-making in democracies. I think your point about sort of the unfeasibility of massive paper plans is well taken, but at the same time, I've learned a lot from experts. They seem to know things. So how do we sort of strike the right balance there, particularly with democratic decision-making?
That's a great question. I was thinking today and emailing about Taiwan, because Taiwan was the most successful country in dealing with COVID. And it was successful for a variety of reasons, but it didn't hurt that the vice president's an epidemiologist. And so I'm of the view, as an expert in history, that experts in epidemiology were pretty important, and experts in virology, and experts in much else. And I don't think it was the expertise that failed. It was the way that it was used. So I would distinguish here between the scientific expertise and the bureaucratic execution. And both the US and the UK, the countries I know best, I think there was perhaps a conceptual error about the nature of the pandemic threat, which was that we should worry about the next big influenza rather than the next SARS or MERS. And I think the scientists in Asia had better understood the implications of SARS and MERS than ours had. But the real point of failure is not, I think, with the scientists. It is with the bureaucrats whose job it was to turn scientific insight into a pandemic preparedness plan. And this is where it gets fascinating, because I think we've got a really dysfunctional system now, which is not peculiar to public health, in which the bureaucracy generates 36-page reports from multiple agencies, usually, that turn out to be useless in a crisis. This was true of the financial system prior to 2008. The regulation of bank capital, which was the ultimate point of failure in 2008, was quite significant, and the Basel rules kept getting more voluminous. But in truth, the more voluminous the regulations, the less effective they were. So I would say the problem is not expertise, it's the way bureaucracy doesn't work, and it's not peculiar to public health. There's a fantastic moment in the book where I quote a lecture given by the Undersecretary, I think, for Preparedness, Robert Kadlec, in Texas in 2018, just after the publication of a pandemic preparedness plan. And in the lecture, he essentially says, well, we don't really have an effective insurance policy against a pandemic. And if we don't build one, we're going to be SOL if there is one, a pandemic. Now, I didn't know what SOL stood for, but probably everybody on this call does. So that was the guy whose one job it was. And I think this was the kind of nasty little secret of our pandemic preparedness, that it wasn't worth the PDF files it was saved on. In Taiwan, by contrast, they have developed a highly nimble system of response to threat, partly because of the neighborhood they live in. I mean, they have every reason to be paranoid about China in every domain. But what Audrey Tang has been pioneering is using digital means to empower citizens and improve information flow from citizens to the government and back. And that's why they were so quick on the draw in January, and so quick to realize that they needed to have mass testing and then contact tracing and isolating infected people. They did all the things that we didn't do. And that's what we need to learn from. It's better to be really quick on the draw than to have a 36-page plan that doesn't actually work.
John Robert Berman writes and helps us understand what SOL stands for. He's from Texas, and it stands for sure out of luck.
That's the polite version. The impolite version that I was told is shit out of luck, and the military certainly use it in that sense. I delve into the origins of SOL as well as snafu and FUBAR in the book, because these are all different ways in which the military think about disaster. If you're in the military, disaster is kind of part of life, and you expect the plan to disintegrate on contact with the enemy. So soldiers have a certain way of thinking about, and airmen and sailors have a way of thinking about disaster, which is quite illuminating to us civilians. Do you want to take John Robert Berman's question?
There are two more. We're running out of time. We have two more questions and several questions on the chat in writing. I am tempted to take one last one on the chat, and then I will read some of those that have been in writing. So thank you for your patience and understanding, those of you who have been waiting patiently. Mark Whitman, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Thanks for your talk. When you were comparing the printing press with the interwar period, or the printing press area being a better analogy, just maybe a slight nuance that, I wonder if you would agree or disagree, is that in the 20s and 30s, we did have a new mass media, and that was radio. And during that period, there were a lot of people, and I'm just speaking for the US, that went on and said anything. And there was one particular a Catholic preacher in the 30s who was politically very much, very isolationist, very anti-Roosevelt, can't remember his name, and he got squashed. I wonder if the nuance is perhaps in the new media of radio. The central government could point at a radio station and say, you will use your license if you have this guy on again. Whereas with the printing press and the internet, the central governments can't point so easily at a server and say, stop that web page. I wonder if you would agree or disagree with that.
Father Coughlin was one of the nastier
You know the name then, okay.
populists of the 1930s, and there was no shortage of fascistic sentiment in parts of the United States in the 1930s. In the fictional counterfactual Philip Roth's Plot Against America, that's sort of the starting point, but it's historically quite accurate, as I found when I was writing War of the World. So yes, radio and television were regulated differently from the internet. And because we're short of time, I'll just put it really briefly. Under Section 230 of the 96 Communications Decency Act, the network platforms have a great catch-22, which is that they are not publishers if they inadvertently host harmful content. But if they decide to censor you, then they are publishers. And so they're impossible, in fact, to hold to account in any law court. And that's the problem. I think if we'd simply treated the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters as publishers from the get-go, then the situation wouldn't be quite as bad as it is. But that's a simplified answer for the sake of brevity. What's very clear is that controlling the internet is harder than controlling radio was. And the Chinese have proved Bill Clinton wrong when he said you can't nail Jello to a wall. They nailed it to the wall. But it's quite a challenging thing to do given just how many moving parts there are out there. And the Chinese have to do a very labor-intensive censorship in order to prevent the Chinese internet from carrying content that the party dislikes. I think the big difference actually between the age of the printing press and the age of the internet is that relatively little printed matter was funded by selling ads. I mean, when you think about how printed matter was disseminated historically, relatively little of it actually contained ads. Newspapers and magazines did ads in a big way in the 20th century, but actually that wasn't key to the finances of publication. And libraries, with public libraries, talking of Carnegie, Moises, I mean, are notable for the fact that they make printed content available without ads, and libraries don't sort material the way that Google does. So I think there are some really big differences there. And if we'd only managed to sort of keep the internet a little bit more like the way print evolved, more Wikipedia, less Google and Facebook, it wouldn't, I think, be such an engine for disinformation and misinformation. We've got time probably for either two very short answers or one.
Yes,
I don't know.
and I have one question of my own that I want to combine with that from Adam. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to give us your perspective on what's likely to happen to the Republican Party. That's something you have studied and analyzed, and in light of your huge knowledge about these things, I wanted to hear you on where is the Republican Party going to be in the near future. And Adam has a question along the same lines. He writes, can you discuss whether you see the attack on the Capitol on January 6th as part of the populism, nativism you mentioned, or might it be the start of a more disturbing path towards violence that could be led by a deeply discredited Republican Party? So combine the two and give us, and that will have to be the last question.
I'll wrap those together. Obviously, it would be a disaster if the Republican Party continued down the road of denying the election outcome and seeking to re-elect Donald Trump. But it would be a disaster for the Republican Party, mainly because it would, I think, almost certainly lead to election defeat. I could imagine this being a little bit like the way the Democrats, after they'd got the habit of nominating William Jennings Bryan, kept doing it. Because remember, populism in the late 19th century took over the Democratic Party. and for a time ensured that it would lose elections with William Jennings Bryan as the candidate. I think that's conceivably an outcome, though it's doubtful to me that Trump would run 3 times. He seems too old to do that. But I could imagine them being sort of unable to get out from under him in the way that befell the Democrats. I don't think this notion of a path to violence is all that convincing. We're constantly being told that there's a vast amount of right-wing terrorism out there that's just teetering on the brink of committing acts of violence. I must say, I find this story a little implausible because the violence that seems to be happening in the United States is mostly either crime or the radical left in cities like Portland. I look at the Capitol occupation as a great fiasco of policing, in which a relatively motley crew of people stumbled into the history books in a way that was almost farcical. Although, of course, one woman died in the process. And I think that if one imagines that this is sort of Weimar Germany, you really haven't read enough about Weimar Germany, because in Weimar Germany, there was large-scale street fighting going on between communists and Nazis for a sustained period of time. And the National Socialist Party was explicitly committed to overthrowing the Weimar Constitution, which is, I don't think, where we are at all. Ultimately, I think Trump has faded faster than most people would have predicted back in January. I said he would fade fast because this is America. And that there's something merciless about the news cycle, especially if you've been canceled from social media. And the real coup of January the 6th was that the President of the United States was deleted from the public sphere by a handful of Silicon Valley executives. That was the truly amazing thing that happened then, not the storming of the Capitol. So my view is that Trump's vanishing. It'll be really hard for him to make a comeback. And Ron DeSantis is the most likely candidate for them in 2024. And he's played a pretty careful game and will run on, I managed the pandemic better without a lockdown. And that's going to represent a return to something like the politically normal. So I'm a relative optimist, as you can tell. And the more people talk about Weimar, the more I'm kind of telling them to chill, because my career began with a book about the Weimar Republic, and I am here to tell you that this is not the Weimar Republic, and nothing close to it. So we'll see. I mean, one of the key things, maybe this is an appropriate note to end on, is that, you know, in applying history, one's attaching probabilities. There's clearly some tail risk in which the Republican Party goes off the rails. But then I think it just is condemned to lose elections. And so my sense is that with a two-party system, there are powerful incentives to return to the center ground if you want to win. I mean, that's the simple way that this system is designed to work. And it's been working that way for a long time.
Niall Ferguson, the author of Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. Niall, thank you so much for spending this hour with us.
So much.
Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this